Hey guys, tonight we drift quietly into a world lit by torchlight and chilled by the sea mist. You can almost hear the soft creaking of wooden ships moored to an icy dock. There's a tang of salt in the air, mingling with something heavier, mead perhaps, or the sharp scent of metal, freshly polished for a feast. Not battle, not tonight. Just the warmth of fur cloaks, flickering firelight, and the hush before a story. You step onto a beach that might not exist in a century that never asked your permission. And you start to wonder, did Vikings really drink from the skulls of their enemies? You probably won't survive this if you're expecting clean facts and simple answers. The line between myth and history here is blurrier than a storm-wet map, and the truth might be hiding under layers of soggy vellum and dramatic poetry. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along the shoreline of your imagination boots, squelching in the fantasy mud of medieval Scandinavia. It's not snowing yet, but the air has that tight, biting feel, like it's thinking about it. Somewhere behind you, a wooden longhouse looms carved dragons snarling at the sky. Inside, warriors laugh too loudly, feast too greedily, and maybe, just maybe, raise a goblet carved from bone. Or do they? The idea is chilling, isn't it? Not just the cold, but the image, a hardened Viking, lifting the polished cranium of a fallen foe to his lips, toasting to victory, with a smile that's equal parts pride and menace. It's metal. It's grim. It's perfect for a heavy metal album cover. But also, it's probably not real. At least, not the way you've heard it. You see, the first whispers of this grim ritual don't come from Viking mouths at all. They come centuries later, in writings suspiciously poetic and conveniently unverified. But before we dissect the myths, the mistranslations, and the morbid fantasies of modern pop culture, let's linger in this fog a little longer. Imagine the rhythm of oars against water, slow and deliberate. Vikings weren't just pirates. They were traders, farmers, poets, and lawmakers. Sure, they raided, but they also read. Well, some of them. Not you, though. You're here to listen, not pillage. They drank mead, yes, ale too, and they raised toasts in the great halls on benches lined with pelts and decorated with carved animal heads. But what did they drink from? The average drinking vessel in Viking-age Scandinavia was surprisingly elegant. Horns were popular, real animal horns, often polished and capped with bronze or silver. Some had intricate bands with knotwork or runes. Others were just smooth, curved, and practical. The catch: you couldn't set them down. Drinking from a horn was a commitment, like a one-night stand with honey wine. You started, you finished. You dealt with the consequences. There were also wooden cups carved from local birch or oak. Occasionally, glassware showed up in richer burials imported from the Frankish kingdoms, maybe even Byzantium. Drinking like a Viking wasn't about brute strength. It was about style, about display, about reminding your neighbors that you were someone. So, where did the skull thing come from? We'll get there. But first, remember this. For all their reputation, Vikings weren't walking horror films. They loved storytelling. They had laws. They had tenderness. Even jokes. It's just that we don't write memes about Vikings cradling their children or composing poetry to the moonlight. We write them about war and blood and drinking from heads. Maybe because we're bored. Maybe because we're dramatic. Maybe because we're still a little scared of what lives in the fog. The first time the idea of skull drinking pops up in any serious way is suspiciously late. Not in Viking-era sagas, not in the archaeological record, not even in angry letters from terrified monks. It comes from a poem written by an Icelandic nobleman in the 1600s. Yeah, 400 years too late. The line in question, something like from the curved branches of skulls we drank, or we drank from skulls of enemies, depending on which scholarly translation you pick, and how tired they were that day. Historians still argue whether that was metaphor mistranslation or just poetic flair. After all, Norse poetry is packed with kennings, those funky compound metaphors, like whale road for ocean or battle sweat for blood. Skull cup could have meant horn. It could have meant we toasted to our enemies' deaths. Or it could have meant nothing at all, just a throwaway image for drama. But once the line was written, it stuck. And not just in history books. It crept into paintings, novels, tabletop games, Dungeons and Dragons, modules, and eventually, your head. See what I did there? You're still standing on that Viking beach, but now you're watching the story shift beneath your feet. You start to realize how easily a myth forms. A single line in a poem, a splash of blood in the wrong direction, a fanatical monk scribbling in the margins muttering, "They're demons." I tell you, it's fun to believe the worst, to paint the past in blood and fire. But it's also exhausting. So, here's the truth. Vikings were human, complicated, messy, sometimes violent, often kind. Their rituals were meaningful, not monstrous. Their feasts were celebrations, not horror shows. But you're not ready to wake up yet. There's more to uncover, more bone-shaped rabbit holes to stumble into. You step off the sand and into the longhouse. The firelight dances. A horn passes from hand to hand. No skulls here. Just stories. Just the beginning. You stay by the fire a little longer. Now, eyes adjusting to the amber glow flickering across wooden beams, blackened by years of smoke. The benches creak under the weight of fur-clad shoulders and beer-soaked laughter. Somewhere in the corner, a dog sighs in its sleep. The air is thick with the scent of roasted meat-wet wool and honeyed alcohol. Someone hands you a drinking horn, warm from the hand, before yours rim slick with sweet mead. It's heavy, not bone heavy, horn heavy. And right there, in your slightly tipsy grip, is the beginning of the truth. Vikings didn't drink from skulls. They drank from horns. Or, well, mostly. The mead horn was more than a vessel. It was a symbol. It curved like a crescent moon, sometimes capped in bronze, sometimes adorned with animal motifs or runes carved in celebration or grief. Some even had tiny chains to hang from the shoulder because nothing says warrior poet like functional accessories. But let's pause here, because part of your brain still wants to cling to the skull idea. It's grittier, cooler, more Viking somehow. So you wonder, why has this image endured? Why does it show up everywhere, from video games to metal concerts to souvenir shops in Reykjavik? Here's the thing. Horns are dramatic, but they don't scream savage. Skull cups do. They satisfy something primal, something edgy. They make Vikings into the kind of people who'd rip off your head and turn it into a wine glass before your ghost even knew what happened. That's marketing gold, but it's not very historical. There are exactly 0 verified Viking skull cups in the archaeological record. Not one. Not even a suspiciously shaped bowl next to a femur and a confused archaeologist named Lars. Instead, what we do find are fragments of horn-carved wood and occasionally imported glass, some tinted blue or green, possibly used only by the elite or during ritual. Drinking for Vikings wasn't just about staying hydrated. It was a performance, a declaration. You raised a cup to honor the gods, to seal an oath, to toast a fallen friend. You drank to remember or to forget. Still you squint into the firelight, half hoping to catch a warrior, draining the skull of his enemy just once. Just a little sip. For history. But he doesn't. He tilts back a polished horn, lets the last of the mead slide down his throat, and slams it on the table. Cheers erupt. A saga begins, and not one skull gets involved. Let's talk logistics. Drinking from a skull sounds brutal until you try to do it. Human skulls aren't exactly ergonomic. They don't sit flat. The bottom is open. The eye sockets stare at you in judgment. To turn one into a drinking vessel, you'd need to slice off the top seal, the edges with metal or resin, and line it to avoid taste and seepage. Even then, it's more blood ritual chic than daily beverage. And yet, other cultures have done it. Tibet, India, parts of Central Asia, sometimes in religious contexts, sometimes in warfare. The famed Scythians, those nomadic warriors of the steppes, were said to use enemy skulls as goblets. Herodotus told us that, so of course we all believed it, though historians still argue whether he was quoting a ritual or just writing ancient tabloid headlines. So, it's possible. But again, not Viking. Let's go back to that poem, the sneaky, misleading one. Written in the 1600s, during a time when Icelandic poets were obsessed with Old Norse mythology The stanza described warriors drinking from curved branches of skulls. That's poetic language for horns. Probably. Maybe. Scholars bicker over this, like it's a Norse version of the dress that was either blue or gold. But imagine the mischief that one phrase caused. A few overzealous translators decided it meant literal skulls. Others ran with it. A myth was born. A chilling, perfect, probably false myth. And once that myth existed, it was unstoppable. The Victorians loved it. Artists painted it. Early historians didn't bother fact-checking it because, well, skulls sell. And then Hollywood found it. And then you did. But the reality, it's a bit more mundane. No skulls, just horns and wooden cups. No bloodthirsty toasts, just long drawn-out sagas with tragic endings and very, very dry humor. That's not to say Vikings were peaceful. They weren't. They fought. They raided. They terrified entire coastlines. But even warriors have rules. And skull drinking, that's more chaos than culture. Some scholars suggest that if skulls were ever used as cups in Viking society, they would have been one-offs, ritualistic, maybe even symbolic, never practical. Perhaps a trophy, kept in a chieftain's hall, dusty, unused, a reminder of some ancient grudge, but not part of regular drinking ware. And again, no evidence. No burial sites with hollowed skull goblets tucked beside honored warriors. No residue of mead inside cranial cavities. No carvings. No mentions in legal codes. No saga passages complaining that Ulf drank too much and chipped Eric's skull again. You sip your imaginary mead and consider the absurdity. We believe things sometimes because they feel right, not because they are right. Skull cups feel right for Vikings, the same way thunder feels like Thor's hammer. It just makes sense in the narrative. But real life, real Vikings, they were busy farming, bartering, building boats, and singing sad songs about winter. Besides, a culture that revered ancestors and honored the dead probably wouldn't turn their heads into drinkware. That's just awkward. You can't call someone Great Uncle Bjorn and sip soup from his skull. So, maybe it's time to retire the image. Or at least admit it's fiction. You shift on the bench. The fire's lower now. Someone's humming a tune in the background, soft minor key, the kind of song that ends with everyone dead and nobody surprised. You smile. Not at the song, at the absurdity of it all. Because even though Vikings didn't drink from skulls, the idea still makes a great bedtime story, and you're not done dreaming yet. The fire crackles, but it doesn't burn bright anymore. It glows low and steady, like the slow unraveling of a lie you didn't know you believed. You're still in the longhouse, still wrapped in the scent of smoke and roasted lamb fat, but now there's a scroll in your lap. Well, not a scroll exactly, more like a poem. A slippery 17th century myth-creating, poor word choice poem. This is where it gets messy. You trace your fingers along imaginary lines of ink, trying to piece together how one line of verse managed to stain Viking history with the color of blood and bone. And, of course, it begins with a poet. It always does. His name was Arne Magnusson, or at least that's the scholar who preserved the source materials. The poem in question, a work by an Icelandic skald, one of those lovely Old Norse bards who laced their stories with enough metaphor to confuse 3 lifetimes of historians. The phrase that caused all the trouble was something like Orbjug vidum hausa, which literally translates to from the curved wood of skulls. Romantic rite, except curved wood of skulls isn't a real thing. It's a kenning, a kind of Norse poetic code. And kennings never mean what they say. Battle sweat means blood. Whale road means sea. Spear din means war. You're basically speaking in riddle all the time. No wonder nobody could get a straight answer out of these guys. So, when this poet wrote that warriors drank from the curved wood of skulls, he probably meant drinking horns. Why? Because horns are curved. They're also wooden, or treated like wood in metaphorical language. And the skull part, that's possibly just another twist of language, possibly meaning mind or intention, or even the spirit of battle. But, and here's where the trouble begins, someone translated it as literally drinking from skulls. Oops. That someone was likely a 19th century scholar trying to clean up centuries of smudged parchment and moody poetry. They may not have been fluent in Old Norse. They may have been guessing, or dreaming, or just really into the idea of bone mugs. Historians still argue whether this mistranslation was an honest mistake, a deliberate embellishment, or just one of those linguistic pranks the past likes to play. One little slip, and suddenly, Vikings are forever immortalized, sipping ale from the hollowed heads of their enemies. It's poetic justice, in a way killed by language, not axes. You lean back against the wooden post behind you, picturing the poor translator hunched over a candlelit desk. Probably cold, probably tired, probably more focused on deadlines than historical accuracy. You can almost hear them mutter, skulls are probably close enough. And with that, the myth took root. It didn't help that the 17th century was a period of rediscovery and romanticization of the Viking Age. Icelandic poets wanted to reclaim a sense of identity, and what better way than painting their ancestors as fierce, noble, terrifying warriors who drank from the bones of the defeated. The funny thing is, the Vikings themselves would have rolled their eyes, because, for them, skulls weren't drinkware. They were symbols of death, yes, but also of memory, of reverence. Even enemy heads were treated with a kind of twisted respect. You might mount one on a pole, sure, but sip from it. That's not just impractical. It's undignified. Besides, Vikings were deeply invested in their image, and image, as it turns out, is fragile. Imagine showing up at a feast with a skull cup. People would stare, not out of admiration, but out of confusion. They might ask if you were feeling okay, if maybe you'd had a rough week, if perhaps you were trying a little too hard. But thanks to this poem, and the murky swirl of translations, revisions, and pop culture stylings that followed the image of the skull-drinking Viking stuck like dried blood on a helmet. It made its way into books, illustrations, museum exhibits, and more than one Bad History Channel reenactment. The horn was forgotten. The poem was forgotten. The context definitely forgotten. But the skull iconic, it's kind of beautiful in a strange way. One misunderstood poetic flourish transformed into centuries of terrifying glory. You almost admire it. Almost. You glance around the longhouse. In the shadows, ghostly outlines of warriors from across time lounge with their drinks horns, wooden cups, glass goblets. No skulls. But in your mind's eye, one stubborn figure remains. He raises a bone-white cup with a grin that dares you to question him. He's not real, but he's famous, and all because of 8 words no one double-checked. So the next time you see a Viking in a video game guzzling wine from a skull, remember, that image isn't a historical artifact. It's a game of telephone played across 1,000 years, a bad translation gone rogue, and the real tragedy. We miss out on the real beauty of Norse poetry, the layered metaphors, the aching sadness, the humor that's drier than winter bark, the poets who could weave a battlefield out of 6 syllables and make you cry about a goat. Instead, we got bone mugs. Cool, sure, but not quite the point. And so you sit there, half asleep, wondering how many other facts are just poorly translated metaphors from poets who never thought anyone would take them literally. The longhouse fades. The scroll in your lap dissolves into smoke. And somewhere in the distance, a poet laughs in Old Norse. You blink slowly as the longhouse melts into mist again. The scroll, the fire, the hum of drunken laughter, it all fades into a softer kind of silence. But you're still inside the story, still floating in the in-between place where facts and folklore swirl like mead in a horn. This time you're not alone. A bearded man appears beside you, wearing a robe more academic than warrior and holding a book far heavier than it needs to be. His name, Snorri Sturluson. And if anyone could have either solved or started the whole skull cup business, it was him. You glance at Snorri, waiting for some grand declaration about skulls and sipping and glorious death. But he's too busy mumbling about meter alliteration and which god slept with whose giant daughter. Typical. Snorri was a 13th century Icelandic historian, politician, and poet. And while he lived well after the Viking Age had ended, he is one of our most important sources on Norse mythology, heroic tales, and cultural details. In other words, he was the lore keeper, the one who preserved what others only whispered around fires. But that preservation came with a price. Snorri had a flair for the dramatic. His prose was thick with myth metaphor and a certain Icelandic spice. He was writing not just to record history, but to entertain, to unify, and to remind the Icelandic people of their heroic and conveniently exciting past. And just like that, the sagas were born. the Heimskringla, the prose, Edda Ynglinga, saga all part of a tapestry woven by Snorri and his literary descendants. And within these sagas, death, vengeance, honor, betrayal, and elaborate drinking scenes, feasts that went on for days, toasts shouted over the clashing of mugs and the moans of poets composing verses between bites of mutton. But no skulls. Not once in all of Snorri's rich and gruesome details does he describe a Viking lifting a human skull to his lips. He gives us gods who shapeshift giants, who birth wolves and ships, made entirely from dead men's fingernails, but not one cozy fireside sip from an enemy's head. Historians still argue whether Snorri edited the past for political purposes, downplayed violence to appear more Christian, or simply didn't think to mention it. After all, he was writing in a post-pagan Iceland where old traditions were preserved but not always practiced. Even so, if skull cups had been a thing, surely he'd have mentioned them. He wasn't shy about violence. He loved a good, gory moment, especially if it helped rhyme with blood. So, we're left with a strange paradox. The man who told us about Thor's goats and Odin's endless thirst for knowledge doesn't breathe a word about skulls being used as drinkware. You'd think that would be memorable. And yet, many modern people assume the sagas are packed with gore and bones and drinking from enemies' scenes, maybe because they feel like they should be. Maybe because once you add in one mistranslated poem, your brain goes hunting for backup. Let's take a moment to talk about kennings again, because Snorri loved them. He didn't just use them, he documented how they worked. He created what was essentially a poetic user manual if you want to talk about the sea use whale road. If you want to describe blood, call it battle dew. So when a later poet used curved wood of skulls, Snorri would have known exactly what that meant. And it almost certainly didn't mean an actual skull. The thing is, Viking poetry wasn't written for the literal-minded. It was layered, ironic, self-referential. It turned war into weather love, into landscapes, and sometimes made ships out of metaphors so convoluted you'd need a flowchart just to stay afloat. Snorri's sagas reflect this playfulness. Yes, they're brutal, but they're also deeply human, full of petty squabbles, sibling drama, and people trying to out-toast each other with increasingly ridiculous boasts. I once killed 10 men with a spoon. I wrestled a troll for my lunch. You know dinner talk. And that's what makes the skull cup myth stand out even more. It's oddly joyless. Viking drinking culture was theatrical, performative, almost comedic at times. They loved toasts, riddles, insults, and clever one-liners. They weren't shy about blood, but they also didn't wallow in it. Drinking from skulls feels like something a cartoon villain would do, not a farmer warrior with a part-time poetry habit. Still, the myth refuses to die. Maybe because the image is too good. Maybe because it scratches an itch modern people have for the barbaric other. Maybe because it gives a clean, punchy answer to a messy, nuanced culture. But the real stories, they're better. They tell of warriors who carved their own drinking horns, who passed them from hand to hand in the glow of hearthlight, who composed verses about the sea while missing 2 fingers and half an ear. They drank to remember the dead, not from them. So, you glance again at Snorri. He's still muttering. Something about Odin. Something about metaphor. He's probably disappointed that his careful work got boiled down to those guys drank from heads. But he also kind of expected it. History is always reshaped by the loudest image, and in this case the image was just too metal to ignore. Still, as you walk away from Snorri's study, the longhouse begins to rebuild itself around you. The sagas echo softly through the beams, tales of lost kings, clever shield maidens, and drunken gods. None of them need skulls to be powerful. None of them needed blood to make them sing. The truth is more subtle, more strange, more poetic, and far more Viking. You're back outside now, boots crunching on frost-laced grass. The longhouse fades behind you, and in its place rises a ship, a long, elegant silhouette with a dragon-headed prow, pulled ashore and resting like a sleeping beast. The sea lies just beyond soft and rhythmic whispering of journeys and secrets buried in the cold. But tonight, you're not here to set sail. You're here for a funeral. It's not just any Viking funeral, though. This one involves a boat, a body, a bonfire, and a lot of alcohol. And as you slip into the ceremony, half invisible, unnoticed by mourners, you wonder if maybe this is where the skull cup comes in, if it ever did. The wind picks up, torches flicker. A woman weeps quietly, holding a bundle wrapped in fur. A man, possibly a brother maybe, a rival, raises a drinking horn skyward and says something sharp in Old Norse. You don't catch the words, but you understand the weight. Because in Viking tradition, death wasn't just an ending, it was a celebration, a transformation, a farewell thick with smoke and song and stories, and always, always a toast. So, what do we know about Viking funerary drinking plenty? But none of it involves sipping from the dead. What we do know is that burial rituals were deeply symbolic. High-status individuals, chieftains, warriors, wealthy traders were often laid to rest in ships, real or symbolic. The ship represented passage, journey, the transition to the afterlife. Sometimes it was set aflame. Sometimes it was buried under mounds of earth. Either way, the dead were sent off with goods, weapons, tools, jewelry, sometimes slaves or animals, and yes, drinking vessels, wooden cups, horns, even imported glassware, if the family could afford it, but never a skull. You crouch near the edge of the burial boat. The body is dressed in full finery, surrounded by artifacts meant to serve in the afterlife. One of the mourners pours mead onto the ground, a libation for the gods, for the departed for memory. Another sips from a horn and then passes it around. Each person drinks, mutters a few words, and lets the next continue the circle. It's communal, sacred, understated, not theatrical, not gruesome. Historians have found actual burial goods matching these scenes, horns inlaid with metal bands, wooden bowls, even ladles. But still no modified skulls, not in graves, not in shrines, not in the soggy pages of Norse law, because the Vikings cared about the dead. Even their enemies were sometimes treated with a strange respect, burned, buried, or left in peace after death. Desecrating a body, that wasn't valorous. That was dishonor. And yet the myth still bubbles beneath the surface. Maybe it's because some Viking burial sites do feature decapitated heads, skulls placed separately from their bodies, sometimes neatly, sometimes not. But context matters. In some cases, the separated skulls were ritual offerings, animal heads placed near the deceased as symbolic guardians. In others, it may have been executions, sacrifices, or simply battlefield cleanup. But never were those skulls hollowed out and turned into drinkware. They weren't trophies. They were remains. Let's not forget, the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were spiritual people. They believed in gods who demanded hospitality and oaths kept. Odin, for instance, was obsessed with knowledge, but he didn't get it by drinking from skulls. He gave up an eye for it. That's a very different kind of sacrifice. Still, there's one odd tale you might cling to, one scrap of poetic weirdness. In a 10th century skaldic poem, a warrior named Egil Skallagrimsson, a real historical figure, supposedly carved runes into a human skull, not to drink from it, not to wear it, just to curse someone. Egil was known for being extra, but even in his tale, the skull is used as an object of power, not a beverage container, a warning, not a mug, a reminder that even the dead deserve a little mystery. And so at this funeral, the fire finally catches. The ship glows gold and orange against the black night. The mead horns are raised one last time. You listen to the final toast, a poem maybe, or just a sigh disguised as words. This is where memory lives, not in bone, but in stories. Still, you can't help but notice the shadows in the firelight. They dance like figures from sagas, the trickster, the berserker, the jarl, and one of them might just be holding a skull, not because it's true, but because the myth refuses to let go. You back away slowly as the fire consumes the ship. There's no screaming, no drama, just warmth, just release. And one final thought lingers with you. If the Vikings ever drank from skulls, it wasn't here. Not at this moment. Not in this way. Because this isn't about conquest. It's about closure. And closure doesn't need a cup. The flames from the burial ship flicker out behind you, replaced by the hush of deep twilight. The sky is bruised purple now, and the stars have just begun to poke through like shy onlookers. You walk inland, boots soft on moss, until another glow emerges, not firelight this time, but candlelight, leaking from the cracks of a wooden hall, larger than most. You slip inside, unseen again, and there it is, a mead hall. Not just any hall, though. Heorot, if the old poets are to be believed. The hall from Beowulf, a poem older than Snorri, older than most of the sagas, older than the Vikings themselves. And here's where things get strange. You're standing in a fictional room based on a poem about a people that may or may not be entirely real, watching a warrior society very much like the Vikings, but not quite them, pass around drinks and stories and sorrow. And just when you think it's all toasts and tales, someone mentions drinking from a skull. Not here in the poem, exactly, but later, in the ripples from the poem, in the way Anglo-Saxon and Germanic war culture gets romanticized and brutalized all at once. Beowulf may not be Norse, but it's close enough that people start to blend it with Viking legend in their heads. That's where things get muddy. Let's pause for a second, because this story, this hall is a crossroads. Beowulf, written in Old English, is a fusion of Christian narrative, pagan myth, and heroic fantasy. It describes warriors lounging in a grand hall, drinking, boasting, and preparing for monstrous things to crawl through the dark. And while no one in the poem explicitly drinks from a skull, the tone, the texture, makes it feel possible. That's the trap. The line between Viking and Anglo-Saxon gets blurred. Germanic tribes, Norsemen, Danish raiders, they all start to blend into one big barbarian stew. And the idea of skull drinking, it floats to the surface like a particularly dramatic carrot. You sidle closer to the boasting bench, where warriors brag between swigs of mead. They thump their chests. They list the things they've killed. One swears he caught a bear with his bare hands. Another says he once headbutted a monk into a wall so hard it left a saint-shaped dent. You suspect he's exaggerating. This is the part of war culture modern people often misunderstand. The boasting wasn't just ego, it was currency. Your worth was tied to your words. Could you spin your deeds into something worth remembering? Could you make yourself the poem? So, it's not surprising that over time these boasts may have inflated. A warrior didn't just defeat his enemy, he made a bowl from his head. He didn't just survive the battle, he commemorated it with cutlery. Historians still argue whether these boasts were metaphor ritual or pure nonsense. But what's clear is this: once stories like Beowulf entered the cultural bloodstream, they helped lay the groundwork for later misunderstandings about Norse rituals. And there's one more twist to the tale. By the time Beowulf was written down, roughly the 8th to 11th century, much of Viking culture was still oral. So, scholars looking for Viking truth often reached for poems like Beowulf, not because they were accurate, but because they were available. It's the historical equivalent of quoting a Marvel movie to explain ancient Roman politics. Still, it's tempting, isn't it? The world Beowulf paints is vivid, immersive, satisfyingly gruesome. And in that atmosphere of shadow and saga, the idea of a skull cup feels right. Or at least close enough for a tired monk copying a manuscript in the 12th century to scribble something dramatic in the margin. So, where does that leave you? Still standing in this poem-turned hall, surrounded by fictional warriors sipping real mead. The cup passes, no skulls, just carved horn and polished wood. But the stories swirl thick stories that will one day be mistaken for truth, carved into museum plaques, whispered in documentaries, memed into oblivion. And this hall, this not Viking hall, becomes yet another reason people think Vikings drank from skulls. Because of proximity, because of poetry, because of a cultural game of telephone where each retelling adds a few more skulls, a few more flames, a few more dramatic pauses. You step back out into the night. Behind you, the warriors laugh, toast sing. The moon hangs low, silver and skeptical. You haven't left the world of Viking myth yet, not even close. But you've now seen one of its oldest roots, one of its earliest misunderstandings. And, like all good bedtime stories, it started with a poem. You wander farther now, the cold thickening around your ankles like rising mist. The ground turns rocky underfoot, and for a moment the familiar scent of pine and sea salt fades, replaced by smoke leather and something far stranger. The landscape changes. Gone are the Nordic fjords. Ahead is a steppeland horizon, flat and endless, where the grass bends low to the will of the wind. You're not in Viking country anymore. You're in Scythian territory now. And the skull cups you've been chasing, they do appear here. It's important that you see this, not to confirm the Viking myth, but to understand just how far and wide skulls have traveled in the cup-shaped imagination of human history. The Scythians were a nomadic people from the Central Asian steppes, roaming between the Black Sea and Siberia long before the Viking Age began. Fierce warriors, skilled on horseback and fond of gold, that curled into stylized animals with snarling faces and spiraling limbs. Think tattooed archers, buried with ornate gear, not just for status, but for storytelling. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Scythians drank wine or blood from the skulls of their enemies. He describes it with a kind of horrified admiration. They'd clean the skull, polish it, sometimes line it with gold or leather, and use it during rituals. It was a gesture not just of victory, but of transformation. Here, finally, is a culture that might have done it. But even this comes with a scholarly asterisk. Historians still argue whether Herodotus was being literal, metaphorical, or simply repeating a traveler's tale he overheard while sipping wine in a coastal marketplace. After all, he also claimed that the Scythians cleaned skulls by scraping them with ox hide as one scrapes a fingernail. Not exactly a verified forensic technique. Still, archaeological evidence in Scythian graves supports some form of skull modification. Ritual trophy. Tableware, unclear, but it's important you see what happens next. This idea, the skull as goblet, catches fire in the imaginations of other cultures. It spreads. Mongol warlords, some Tibetan Buddhist sects, even a few medieval European noblemen with, let's call them, eccentric hosting preferences, all have skulls crop up now and then in their ceremonial drinking practices. Sometimes it was symbolic, sometimes theatrical, occasionally practical. Bone was durable, shaped, right sealed with resin, or metal. It could be used. Not comfortably, but effectively. You pause here, because this is where the Viking myth starts to mutate. The further west these stories travel, the more they shift. By the time they reach 9th or 10th century Europe, just in time for Vikings to be raiding monasteries and starring in every local horror story, people begin to connect dots that don't exist. Vikings are terrifying. Skull cups are terrifying. Therefore, Vikings must drink from skulls. It's logic, terrible logic, but logic nonetheless. You imagine a Frankish monk scribbling in a dim cell. He's heard stories of Norsemen burning churches, dragging away relics, howling into the night. He remembers hearing about skull drinking from travelers on the eastern road. His hand shakes. He writes it down. And just like that, another myth is born. Even in medieval Russia, some tales depict Norse Rus rulers, descendants of Scandinavian settlers, holding feasts where human skulls are presented. Again, though, it's all second-hand, poetic, hazy, never quite solid. Historians find themselves in a strange position. They know other cultures did it. They know the Vikings had access to those stories, maybe even the vessels themselves through trade or war. But that leap from having heard of it to having done it is one no evidence supports. It's the academic equivalent of seeing a samurai sword in a pawn shop and assuming the cashier trained in feudal Japan. You look up. The wind howls now low and wide across the steppe. You see horsemen in the distance, dark silhouettes against a pale sky. Their robes flap like wings. One of them carries something glinting. A bowl, maybe gold, maybe bone. You can't tell. But it's not Viking. The Vikings were maritime, seafaring, earthy. Their world was salt and snow and soot. The Scythians lived with sky and dust and flame, different soil, different gods, different ghosts. You turn away from the steppe. Because this detour wasn't to confirm the skull drinking, it was to clarify the confusion, to trace where the idea may have originated before it hitchhiked into Viking lore. And it's not the only time that happened. Myths move, stories migrate, and when you're half asleep around a hearth, it's easy to forget where one tale ends and another begins. So, no Vikings probably didn't drink from skulls, but they may have heard of someone who did. And centuries later, that was enough. The wind shifts again, and the steppe fades like a dream. The soft crunch of hooves on dry grass becomes the low slap of waves against wood. You're back near the coast now, different shore, unfamiliar sun. The cold isn't gone, but it's thinner, less biting. A strange voice reaches your ears, speaking in a language that curls and cracks like fire on parchment. You've found Ibn Fadlan. You don't recognize him at first. robes too clean, gaze too sharp, but he stands out like a comma in a saga. He's not a Viking, he's a visitor, a 10th century Arab diplomat sent from the Abbasid Caliphate to the Volga Bulgars somewhere in what's now Russia. And he brought something few others did, a written account of the Norse, or rather the Rus people he encountered on the riverbanks. And oh, did he have thoughts. He describes them as tall, ruddy, filthy, loud, fascinating, terrifying, barbaric, beautiful. Pick a contradiction, he saw it. And crucially, he saw their funerals. This is where things start to twist again, because in the middle of Ibn Fadlan's wildly expressive account, somewhere between the bodily functions and the bare pelts, is a scene of ritual death. A Viking chieftain dies. His slave girl volunteers to join him in death. There is alcohol, there is chanting, there is a boat, there is fire, there is a priestess in strange clothes, there is a blade, and there are drinks. Drinks passed around, drinks poured into the mouth of the dead, drinks raised in farewell. But there are no skulls. No one, not even in this heightened, horrified, extremely dramatic retelling, drinks from the head of the fallen. Not even when they had the chance. Not even when it would have made for the perfect flourish in a diplomatic horror story. And yet, centuries later, modern writers latch onto Ibn Fadlan's descriptions like seagulls on a fish cart. They comb through his pages looking for dirt, gore, and bone. And while there's plenty of cultural misunderstanding and no shortage of detail that reads like it came from a fever dream, the skull cup still isn't there. Historians still argue whether Ibn Fadlan exaggerated to make the Norse seem more primitive, or whether he simply didn't understand what he was witnessing. After all, he calls them the filthiest of God's creatures, while simultaneously describing them as tall, muscular, and handsomer than any men he'd ever seen. There's admiration, there's revulsion, there's drama, which is exactly the combination that gets people thinking, surely these guys drank from skulls. But here's what matters. Ibn Fadlan was watching. He was writing. And even he, with all his vivid storytelling, never mentions skull cups. He saw blood, yes. He saw ritual. But the vessel's wooden, horn, ceramic. You look around. The Rus stand by the riverbank, broad-shouldered and silent. Their eyes are pale, their hands calloused. They glance at Ibn Fadlan with curiosity, not hostility. One offers him a horn. He hesitates, takes it, sips. The mead is sharp, unfamiliar, but drinkable. The drinking horn gleams gold in the afternoon light, not because it's made of gold, but because the sun's caught it just right. And you realize something simple. A culture doesn't need skulls to be strange or brutal or compelling. They just need to be misunderstood. Ibn Fadlan's travelogue became famous centuries after his death. For a long time it was tucked away in Arabic manuscripts, forgotten, misquoted, repurposed. In the 13th century, pieces of it reappear in other texts, often with bits, missing names scrambled, or entire paragraphs replaced by insert shocking ritual here. By the 20th century, modern writers began using it as raw material for fiction. Michael Crichton adapted parts of it into Eaters of the Dead, which then became the film The 13th Warrior. And guess what shows up in the film? That's right, skull, cups. Because of course they do. That one ancient source, misread and mythologized, fed into a cinematic vision, where Vikings became grunting beasts drinking from the heads of the fallen like they were sipping lattes. Artistic license, historical fan fiction, and you half asleep now can't help but smile. Because the original story, the one without the skulls, is still the more haunting one. The quiet ritual, the burning boat, the lone girl stepping into flame for reasons no one quite agrees on, the priestess whispering something only the wind remembers. Real history doesn't need embellishment. It's already strange enough. You drift from the riverbank. Ibn Fadlan is still scribbling, brow furrowed. He's trying to make sense of what he saw. He doesn't know that his words will be twisted for centuries. He doesn't know about the t-shirts, the fantasy games, the dramatic audiobook narrations. He just wants to get home. And if even he didn't see a skull cup, maybe that should tell us something. The river fades behind you, like ink soaking into vellum, and now you find yourself walking along a different current, this one slower, deeper, winding through something far stranger than myth. Viking belief, not the gods, not yet. That comes later. Right now you're wading knee-deep into their view of the world, of fate, of war, and what it meant to win, to lose, and to keep something from your enemy. You step into a clearing. The grass is red with twilight or something more ominous. Around you are shapes, shields, spears, iron helmets with no horns. Because remember, those were a 19th century opera designer's idea, not Viking couture. And just ahead, half lit by a low orange glow, is a row of poles. On top of each, a head. But again, not drinking vessels, just trophies. Because this is something Vikings did do. They took heads. They displayed them. They sent messages with them. Don't raid here. Don't betray us. Don't forget who won. And you can feel it in your chest, the raw, heavy purpose of it. This wasn't chaos. It was message, ritual, weird. Now weird isn't just fate. It's deeper, more entangled. It's the threadwork of existence, the web of cause and consequence that even the gods couldn't escape. And Vikings, they didn't believe in happy endings. They believed in endings that made sense. So if you died in battle, that was fine as long as your death meant something. Your skull on a pole was a sentence in someone else's saga. But your skull as a cup, that's where the meaning falls apart. Drinking from the dead wasn't a natural extension of honor. It was personal, disrespectful in a way that didn't align with how Norsemen dealt with death. The body could be a battlefield, but the soul, that was sacred territory. Still, you can't ignore the temptation. You imagine a warrior standing over a slain enemy, carving the skull, hollowing it, raising it like a goblet as a challenge to the gods. You want to believe in that level of theatrical cruelty, but you also know it's the kind of thing people think warriors should do, not what they actually did. Because real warriors, especially those obsessed with fate, didn't waste time with trophies they couldn't explain to Odin. Historians still argue whether the heads on poles were everyday intimidation or part of deeper rites. In some texts, captured kings are beheaded, and their heads sent to enemies like ghastly business cards. In others, it's more symbolic, offering the head to a god or placing it near a burial mound as a spiritual offering. But drinking from it, no texts, no sagas, no laws, no graves, no fragments, just silence. Instead, the true markers of victory were often rings, or weapons, or poetic boasts so sharp they could slice a reputation in two. You remember the practice of flighting a formal insult contest like rap battles, but colder and drunker. Warriors didn't sip skull blood to show dominance. They spat out verses like daggers, each line designed to humiliate, to elevate, to immortalize. You didn't win by guzzling gore. You won by saying, "I defeated you, and now I've made a better poem about it." Now that's Viking. Still, there's one poetic line that keeps coming up in these debates. A stanza from a skaldic poem where a warrior drinks from the curved wood of the mind's tree, which, again, people desperately want to believe means skull. But once more, it's probably metaphor. A kenning for horn, or for wisdom, or for memory. Because here's a thing Vikings did believe, that memory had weight, that the names of the dead lived longer than their bones, that stories could resurrect better than magic, that the real victory wasn't turning your enemy into a cup, but turning them into a cautionary tale. You turn now and see one last head, not on a pole, but on a mound, quiet, clean, cradled in dirt. You're at a gravesite. The warrior buried here wasn't famous. No sagas sing of him. No horns blow for his return. But he was given his weapons, his cloak, his cup. Not a skull, a wooden bowl, worn smooth by use, tucked gently beneath his hand. The message isn't loud, but it's clear. Even in death you drink with dignity, and so you stand there, letting the wind press against your face like a silent verse. You've seen heads on poles. You've heard boasts sharper than blades. You've watched warriors take what they were owed, but never once have you seen a skull used like a stein. And maybe that's the real message. Not everything horrifying is true. And not everything true is horrifying. You step away from the burial mound, but you're not alone. Shadows trail you, tall draped in wolf pelts and iron, muttering in low voices about glory and doom and next winter's ale. These aren't just warriors. They're poets, hype men of their own legend, because now you're entering the realm of the Viking brag. And if there's anything that might explain why people believe Vikings drank from skulls, it's this: the Norse were masters of myth-making, especially when the myth was about themselves. You settle beside a smoky fire where two men argue not with fists, but with words. One says he killed 3 men with an axe made from whalebone. The other says he once took down 7 with a single glance. Everyone listening knows they're lying. Everyone's still impressed. Because Viking culture didn't just allow exaggeration, it rewarded it. This was a society where your reputation outlived your body, where the way you were talked about mattered as much as how you lived. If you died heroically, you might be remembered. If you said you died heroically well, that worked too. And so, over time, things that never happened started sounding like things that might have. It's easy to see how I slew my enemy becomes I took his head, which becomes I drank from it, which becomes a bedtime story, a footnote in a scholar's book, a cartoon, a meme, a Halloween costume. It happens slowly. One line in a poem, one sketch in a manuscript, one storyteller a little too deep into the mead. Vikings had a word for this drotkvet, a form of courtly verse packed with metaphor, exaggeration, and rhythm so tight it could hold its breath. You didn't just say you were strong. You said you were the storm on the ridge of shields. You didn't just insult someone, you described them as the butter under the blade. And if you really wanted to seem terrifying, you hinted, his bones served me well. I raised a toast from what he left behind. No skulls mentioned, but heavily implied. And that implication, that's the sweet spot, the dangerous space between reality and suggestion. It's where Skull Cup legends are born. Historians still argue whether these poetic boasts were meant to be believed or just admired for their flair. After all, no one hears a rapper claim he's a god and calls the Vatican. It's about performance. And in Viking halls, performance was survival. You look around. The longhouse walls blur in and out again. One warrior pounds the table. Another stands on the bench, retelling a raid where he supposedly strangled a bear using only a shoelace and bad attitude. You squint. No one believes him. But no one stops him either. Because in a world where few people could read or write, your only proof of greatness was how well you could sell it. And sometimes the best stories weren't the truest. They were the ones that made jaws drop. So when someone somewhere said, I drank from my enemy's skull, no one needed to fact check. They just needed to feel it. It was never about accuracy. It was about impact, and it didn't stop with warriors. Even the gods got involved. Odin himself, old one-eyed wisdom-hungry, was known for doing strange poetic things. He hung himself from the world tree to learn the runes. He traded an eye for insight. He spoke in riddles and wrapped truths in metaphor. So, when his followers imitated him, they weren't looking for clean facts. They wanted layers, symbolism, something people could chew on and debate for generations. If a Viking poet said he drank from a skull, maybe it meant he conquered his fear, or he silenced his rival, or he finally understood what it meant to live beyond death. Or maybe he was just trying to outbrag someone else. You remember this as you walk through the fading firelight. The real danger isn't that Vikings drank from skulls. The real danger is that someone once claimed they did, and nobody forgot it. Even today, the Viking brand is strong, sold in mugs, movies, motivational posters. It's been polished and weaponized, turned into fitness programs and philosophy quotes. And beneath all that muscle and myth, a single line, a single boast. And like any good boast, it grew. But tonight, you're not buying it. You've seen too many toasts raised in horns, too many burials with clean, intact heads, too many stories that started with poetry and ended with misunderstanding. You keep walking. The night is quiet now, except for one voice behind you. He's still bragging, still shouting, still trying to become immortal. And maybe, in some way, he did. You slip away from the mead hall before another poem takes hold. Outside, the air is cooler, calmer. The wind plays with your cloak, imaginary, though it is, and you find yourself walking through time, centuries, peeling back like flaking paint. You're not in a saga anymore. You're in a studio, a modern one. A green screen glows. A plastic helmet sits on a foam axe. A director waves his hand and says, "Okay, Skull Cup scene. Take 3. Welcome to pop culture, the real Skull Cup, capital of the world." Because if the Vikings didn't drink from skulls, someone forgot to tell Hollywood, or video game developers, or fantasy novelists, or the guy at the Renaissance Fair selling 75 bone tankards to tourists in cargo shorts. You know the image. A muscled warrior, shirtless for some reason, raising a glistening, polished human skull full of ale. Thunder rumbles, lightning flashes. Everyone claps. It's dramatic. It's iconic. It's totally wrong. But it's everywhere. And here's the twist, even though it's fake, it's also kind of perfect. It tells you what you want to know about a character before he even speaks. He drinks from a skull. He's the bad guy, or the wild one, or the one who's definitely not house-trained. The Skull Cup has become a cinematic shorthand for brutality, for dominance, for danger wrapped in a jawbone. And no one ever questions it. Why would they? It feels right. The Viking brand is all about extremes, bloodfire, betrayal, redemption. Add a Skull Cup to that, and it all just clicks. No one wants to see a guy say, "Let's discuss trade routes," while sipping tea from a mug that says "World's Best Jarl." They want the skull. And pop culture delivers. It starts subtly. In early romantic paintings of Norse warriors, Victorian-era stuff where everyone looks constipated, but noble. Then comes pulp fiction, comics, tabletop RPGs, video games, each one taking the myth a step further. By the time you get to Skyrim or God of War, the Skull Cup isn't even questioned. It's as essential as the beard. You step into a comic panel now. The lines are sharp, the colors oversaturated. A warrior yells something like "to Valhalla" while raising a skull that drips something probably not FDA approved. It's hilarious and a little sad, because that myth born from one poetic misstep now has more cultural weight than any artifact law code or grave site. Historians still argue whether pop culture helps or hurts public understanding. One side says, at least people are interested now. The other says, yes, but they think Odin was played by Anthony Hopkins. It's not just entertainment, though. The Skull Cup made its way into advertising, products, tattoos. You've seen them, some guy with runes he can't pronounce inked on his arm, lifting weights in a blood of my enemy's tank top. It's not history, it's aesthetic, but aesthetics matter. They shape how we remember things, what we care about, what we pass on. And in this case, the myth won. Because let's face it, wooden bowls just don't sell as well. They're not edgy. They're not alpha. They're not going to headline a Netflix reboot. But maybe there's something else here. Something quieter. Maybe the Skull Cup myth survived not because it was true, but because it captured a feeling. The sense that the past was rougher, stranger, more intense. That people lived closer to death and therefore celebrated life in ways that shock us, even if those ways weren't real. You step out of the comic, the screen fades, the props disappear, and you're left standing in a museum gift shop. You browse the shelves, shot glasses shaped like craniums, mead bottles with axes on the label, Viking helmets with two proud, inaccurate horns. There's even a beer called Skull Cup. It's all here, sanitized, stylized, sanitized again. The past turned product. You pick up a mug. It's heavy ceramic with a fake crack running across the brow ridge. It's not real, but you already knew that. What's real is the human need behind it, to make meaning, to remember, to feel something ancient burning beneath your modern skin. And maybe, just maybe, the Skull Cup does that, not by being accurate, but by being unforgettable. So, you set the mug down, because you've already seen the truth, and it's far more interesting than a prop. You leave the gift shop behind the plastic skull mugs, rattling quietly on their hooks as the automatic doors hiss shut. The fluorescent light gives way once more to moonlight soft, forgiving, honest in ways that marketing never is. You're back out under the stars now, and your next steps take you somewhere colder. Not metaphorically, literally colder. You're heading into a dig site. The ground is frozen half the year here, so archaeologists work fast when they can, brushing, cataloging, unearthing a past that refuses to reveal itself easily. And here you are, ghosting silently between rows of half-dug graves, tables of artifacts under tarp, and the quiet scratch of trowels on soil. Because it's time to talk about evidence. So far we've walked through poems, boasts, travelers' tales, and Hollywood fantasy. But what do we actually know about Viking drinking vessels from the ground up? Here's where it gets surgical. In over a century of Viking archaeological digs, thousands of burials, ship graves, and hoards uncovered across Scandinavia, the British Isles, Russia, and beyond, there have been 0 confirmed human skulls turned into drinking cups. None. Not a single one with polished lips, no metal-rimmed craniums, no half-shells of bone repurposed for ritual toasting. What we do find, horns often capped in bronze or trimmed with silver, sometimes inlaid with simple designs. Wooden cups carved from birch oak or yew, glass vessels imported or traded, often from the Carolingian Empire, Byzantine world, or Saxon artisans. These were rare high-status items, ceramic jugs and bowls, simple and utilitarian. Occasionally, ladles or scoops made from horn or bone, but never human bone. You kneel beside an open grave. There's a skeleton laid out in peace arms, crossed over a chest, where time has turned cloth to shadow. Nearby, an iron sword, a brooch, and a horn cracked and half decomposed, but clearly shaped, clearly crafted, clearly not a skull. In some high-status female burials, there are even keys, symbols of home of order. Women were the keepers of the hearth, the mead hall, the daily ritual of life. If anyone was going to be serving drinks, it was likely them, and none of them did so with a piece of someone's head. There is one grave, though, that gets people excited. Found in the 1930s, the Oseberg ship burial, one of the richest Viking-age tombs ever uncovered. 2 women buried in a lavishly carved ship, with dozens of object sleds, tapestries, wooden carts, animal bones, and drinking vessels. Among them, ornate buckets, ladles, horns, and one deeply carved wooden bowl. But again, no skulls. You glance over a catalog spread out on a folding table nearby. It's full of neat little diagrams. Object 34A, horn fragment, bronze cap, traces of resin. Object 56, carved wooden bowl, decorative trim. Nothing that says Object 66, human head, now a teacup. Still, some insist we just haven't found the right grave yet. Historians still argue whether the absence of skull cups is a result of poor preservation, incomplete excavation, or simple chance. But even if a few were used once somewhere, it clearly wasn't common. Not enough to be reflected in the material culture, not enough to shape ritual law or daily life. Because in archaeology, patterns matter. One strange item might be a fluke, but repetition, that's culture. And skull cups just aren't part of that pattern. What is a reverence for craftsmanship? Horns carved with dragons, bowls painted with spirals, the occasional imported Roman glass bottle buried like treasure. Vikings didn't need bone cups to feel powerful. They needed objects that told stories. And when you think about it, a drinking horn made from a prized animal-shaped, polished, passed down, is a story. A goat raised for war. A stag hunted on the last frost of winter. A bull sacrificed to Thor. It's not just about what you drank from. It's why. Back at the dig site, someone turns over a small shard. It's part of a bowl rim intact, a faint line of ornamentation still clings to the edge, carved waves, maybe, or stylized teeth. You think about how easily this could be misread. 1,000 years from now, someone finds your favorite coffee mug, cracked, glazed with Monday Slayer, written in chipped gold, and decides it was part of a blood ritual. And maybe that's what we've done with the Vikings, turned their vessels into violence, their meals into mayhem, their feasts into fright. But the earth tells a quieter story, a slower one dug out inch by inch, catalogued, preserved, whispered through carbon dating and cautious interpretation. No skulls, just people, living, drinking, remembering. You brush the dirt off your hands even though they're only metaphorically dirty and walk away from the sight. The stars above seem colder now, but also more honest. You've seen the facts. The rest is poetry. The night deepens now, not darker, but deeper, like falling into thicker sleep. You've left the dig site behind, and in its place rises the shimmer of candlelit feasting tables, long as ships' banners of woven wool dancing above, and the steady rhythm of conversation, laughter, and the unmistakable clink of drink against drink. Tonight we enter the world of prestige, drinking, not fantasy, not fan fiction, but what Vikings actually drank from when it mattered. And spoiler, it wasn't bone. You settle onto a bench near the edge of the hall, where the light bends around pewter plates and hand-carved spoons. A woman with silver braids holds a ladle carved from antler. She dips it into a bucket of mead and pours into a drinking horn capped with delicate filigree. Beside her, another guest drinks from a shallow wooden bowl worn smooth from generations of use. You begin to notice something. Everything here is crafted. The details aren't crude. They're careful, ornate, decorative, in a way that speaks more to wealth and connection than brute force. You watch a chieftain lift his horn. It's capped in bronze polished to a near mirror. It's heavy in the hand not just with mead, but with meaning. The horn might have been a gift from a king, a spoil from a raid, a family heirloom. Because in Norse society, status wasn't just about what you owned, it was about what your possessions said about you. And your drinking vessel, that said plenty. Glass, for example, was rare, almost mythical, imported through trade routes that reached deep into the Carolingian Empire, sometimes even from Byzantium. When glass cups appear in graves, they often have pride of place, carefully wrapped, gently placed, as if saying, "This person mattered." If you drank from glass, you weren't just wealthy. You were connected, sophisticated, worldly. Vikings didn't just take, they traded too. Even the wooden cups were individualized, carved with family marks, animals, knotwork. And the drinking horns, not crude chunks of cattle leftovers. They were sanded, sealed, sometimes gilded. They were theatrical, yes, but in the way a wedding ring is theatrical, symbolic, public, anchored in tradition. And again, no one's drinking from a skull. Historians still argue whether the more gruesome imagery in later literature comes from real cultural practice or imported fantasy. Some suggest that the skull cup myth might have been borrowed from Celtic tales. Early Irish sources sometimes mention enemies' heads as trophies. But even in those, they're not used as mugs. They're warnings, decorations, maybe conversation starters, but definitely not dishware. You look across the hall. Another man raises a cup. It's not horn or glass. It's metal, possibly silver, with niello inlay, forming twisting dragons. That's high-end. That's ceremonial. That's not your average Tuesday night drink. Because Norse culture, like any culture, had its layers. Not every Viking was a raider. Not every raider was rich. But everyone wanted to be seen, and being seen, holding a finely made drinking vessel, that was a statement, a performance, a claim. Which brings us back to skulls. There is no archaeological evidence, nor any saga-confirmed account of a decorated, prestigious human skull used as a drinking object. Because while Vikings weren't squeamish, they weren't careless either. Bone might last, but it's ugly, difficult to handle, easily cracked, and emotionally loaded. Meanwhile, bronze, glass, and horn, those shine, literally and metaphorically. You start to see the logic. The more beautiful the vessel, the more powerful the drink, not just in taste, but in meaning. A toast wasn't just about getting drunk. It was a social contract, a way to bind warriors, families, communities. A drink offered to Odin or Freya or a dead father was a kind of spell. And who casts a spell with a skull that would ruin the mood? Instead, there were ritual goblets, some double-handled, some shared communally. In certain regions, archaeological digs have revealed communal drinking bowls with wide lips designed for multiple guests to sip in turn. A test of trust, a symbol of shared fate. The Vikings understood performance, but they also understood propriety. Certain acts were too sacred to sully with horror. Drinking was one of them. You scan the feast again. Everything is alive with symbolism. Every cup passed, every horn raised, every sip a quiet vow. Someone tells a story, a trader, who brought back 3 blue glass flasks from Frisia. Another one about a bride's dowry, which included a carved maple bowl blessed by a vulva, a seeress. The drinks aren't just drinks. They're histories in motion. And you begin to realize something that no myth can cover. Skull cups are easy drama, but Viking vessels, they were intimacy, identity, memory. Even their gods drank from special cups. Odin's never-ending horn, Aegir's ale kettle. Every vessel had a name, a function, a story. A skull has no such lineage. It's a dead end. And Vikings, they hated dead ends. So you lean back on the bench. Your cup, let's say it's horn, let's say it's carved with waves, rests warm in your hand. You look around the hall, lit with flickering oil lamps, full of warmth, full of noise, full of everything but gore. And for the first time tonight, you don't miss the myth. Because the truth, it's far more beautifully crafted. The feasting hall fades behind you, not like a door closing, but like a story pausing mid-sentence. The echoes of laughter and clinking horns soften into silence, and soon you find yourself walking into a very different space. It's quieter here, not somber, not sacred, just clever. You're in a village now, somewhere modest, somewhere real. No grand halls, no golden horns, no ships buried beneath barrows, just smoke curling from turf-roofed homes, the chatter of livestock and the occasional chuckle of someone who knows the punchline before you do. Because this part of Viking life, it's not about violence or victory. It's about humor. And maybe, just maybe, that infamous skull cup was never meant to be taken literally at all. You walk past a group of children playing with wooden swords. One of them raises a bowl and yells, "To Valhalla," before spilling water down his shirt and collapsing in mock death. His friends laugh, rolling in the dirt. And that's the point. Vikings laughed a lot. Their sagas are full of jokes, dark, dry, absurd, and frequently aimed at death itself. This was a culture that respected cleverness. Poets were warriors. Tricksters were gods. Your ability to insult your opponent without spilling a drop of mead legendary. And sometimes those jokes blurred the line between reality and metaphor. Take the tradition of kennings again, those compound expressions that turn battle into sword storm or sea into whale road. You remember them. They followed you through this journey like poetic breadcrumbs. But now you see how they might have misled more than just translators. Let's say a poet says, "I drank the sorrow of the slain." It sounds fierce, terrifying. But what if he meant mead, poured in honor of a fallen friend? What if skull was just a stand-in for loss? Historians still argue whether many of these dramatic phrases were poetic conventions, metaphors, or just inside jokes passed off as epic lore. But Norse poetry, especially in the Rimur tradition, was often self-aware. It played with double meanings. It liked misleading the listener, only to laugh at them later. So, when a skald said he drank from the mind's hollow, he might have been performing. You peer into one home now. A woman sits by the hearth, weaving. A young man next to her recites verse, something about Odin goats, and a woman whose eyes could see weather patterns. The woman smirks. She's heard this one before. Because Norse humor wasn't slapstick, it was layered, subtle, often biting. And in that context, claiming to drink from a skull, that sounds less like a boast, more like a joke. Last night I drank from Thorgrim's skull. Oh, really? Did you chew your mead too? Laughter. You can almost hear it. You can almost feel it. The kind of cultural wink that gets lost when scribes centuries later try to write it down without a smile. And let's not forget the sagas themselves. They're brutal, yes, but they're also ridiculous. Characters fall into rivers during sword fights. Ghosts forget their own names. Farmers argue with their goats. One saga features a man who becomes famous for being angry at birds. In Egil's saga, the titular poet warrior is often caught between moments of extreme violence and biting wit. He insults kings to their faces, composes verses while bleeding, and once drinks so much that people genuinely think he's possessed. But drink from a skull? Never. Yet someone reading that saga centuries later, especially through the filter of translation, missing context, and a hunger for drama, might take a line or two of poetic exaggeration and say, "Ah, so that's how they did it." You step back outside. The stars have shifted. A dog barks in the distance. Somewhere, someone sneezes and immediately blames Loki. This is the Viking world as it more likely was alive, sarcastic, flawed, not the endless, slow-motion battle scene some want it to be. And, in that world, the skull cup might have existed not as an object, but as an idea, a symbol of absurdity, a punchline about war, a poetic twist about grief, maybe even a wink at fate, because in Norse myth, even gods die. Even gods get played. Even gods get drunk and fall into a ditch. So maybe the real joke is this: we took a metaphor, literally, and built a whole mythos around it. Maybe the skull cup isn't a lie. Maybe it's a setup. And we've been the straight man this whole time. You follow the laughter through the night, and slowly the village fades. The flickering hearths, the gleam of carved horn, the clever insults muttered under breath, they all dissolve like fog in morning sun. And now, for the first time in a while, the silence is tense. You've arrived at a place with no stories, not Viking ones anyway. You're standing on the shore of a Christian monastery, a place that once rang with bells and prayer, now ringed by scorched earth, torn manuscripts and shattered glass. A place where Vikings happened, and this, perhaps more than any poetic metaphor, is where the skull-drinking myth really grew teeth. Because when the raiders came silent at first, like smoke, they left behind no press releases, just fear. And fear writes its own kind of history. You step through the rubble of Lindisfarne, or maybe it's Iona, or Wessex. Take your pick. The pattern was the same: ships on the horizon, iron on the altar, and the world turned upside down. The monks, scribes, and frightened villagers left only fragments, some in ink, some in whispers. They called the Norse heathens, not just outsiders, but spiritual contamination, wild-eyed, laughing men who desecrated churches and butchered saints. Is that accurate? Sometimes, but the details, that's where fear exaggerates. It always has. And what's more terrifying than a man who kills you? A man who turns your head into a drinking vessel. So when the chroniclers of the time tried to describe these raids, they reached for the most horrifying imagery they could find. Pagan rites, blood rituals, cannibalistic echoes, the bones of martyrs hollowed into toasts, and yet no real evidence. just fear stylized into parchment. You see it in the letters written to Rome, begging for aid. They've come from the north, and they drink from our dead. Not literally, just effectively, symbolically. A poetic truth twisted into terror. You can almost imagine the scribe scribbling faster, the image forming as he writes a monk's skull filled with mead, passed hand to hand in a ring of ash and fire. It didn't happen, but it worked. Historians still argue whether this fear was strategic, used to garner political support and inflame religious fervor, or simply emotional. But either way, it stuck. And from that moment on, Vikings became monsters, not men, not traders, not farmers, but howling beasts who didn't just kill their enemies, they drank them. Never mind that many Norse were baptized. Never mind that Viking towns like Hedeby and Birka had Christian churches before some English villages did. Never mind that trade routes stretched from Dublin to Baghdad. The Skull Cup drowned nuance in one gulp. Later, chroniclers doubled down. As Europe unified under banners of crown and cross, the Norse became useful villains, playable bad guys in morality tales, straw men for sermons, cautionary corpses, and the Skull Cup that became shorthand. Even today you still hear it whispered in documentaries with ominous narration. The Vikings may have even drunk from the skulls of their enemies. There it is again. The may have. Not did. Not likely did. Just may. Which is history's version of, well, I heard a guy say. You look around the ruins. Time has smoothed their edges. Ivy climbs walls that once echoed with terror, and still the myth lingers like a shadow at the edge of the candlelight, because once something becomes terrifying, it rarely gets a second chance at truth. But maybe we're due. Because the Vikings weren't the only violent force of their time, nor were they the only ones misunderstood. You sit on a mossy stone, imagining a monk and a Viking meeting without blood, maybe in a trade port, maybe over shared wine, maybe with awkward silence and too many hand gestures, and maybe, just maybe, they saw something familiar in each other. But that version, it never got written. Too boring, too hopeful, too human. So instead the myth persisted, because people believed what they were afraid to question. And over centuries, the Skull Cup didn't disappear. It evolved, from whispered propaganda to poetry to pop culture. And now it's bedtime lore. You look out to sea. No ships tonight. Just waves. Just silence. And a myth that was never true, but never quite a lie either. The waves crash gently now, rhythmic as breathing. You turn away from the shore, your path lit only by the pale brushstroke of moonlight across the earth. The air is damp, the kind of damp that seeps into wool and wood. You're moving inland again, not to a hall, not to a grave, but to a question. Who were the Vikings really? It's a harder question than it looks. Not because the answers are complicated, though they are, but because the word Viking itself is slippery. You walk through the years, and with each step, the definition shifts. Viking wasn't an ethnicity. It wasn't even a fixed identity. It was a job description, a temporary role. To go Viking meant to raid, to travel, to risk. But not all Norse people went Viking. Most didn't, and not all who did were Norse. The word applied to Danes, Swedes, Norwegians, sometimes even Slavs and Finns, who took to the sea with the same intention opportunity, which is important. Because if we say the Vikings drank from skulls, what we're really saying is, who exactly? A fisherman from Jutland, a merchant son from Burka, a hired sword in the Kievan Rus, or just the guy your ancestor really didn't like and exaggerated about in his diary. You step into a trading port now, vivid, loud, alive. Skins, spices, amber, glass beads, strung like stars. There's a woman selling woven cloth, a man haggling over a Byzantine jug, a child chasing a chicken. You pass dozens of faces. They speak Old Norse, yes, but also Old Saxon, Old Irish, Arabic, Latin. The world here is connected far more than we like to imagine. There's no skulls. There's too much commerce for that. In fact, some of the wealthiest Norse towns weren't raider bases at all. They were market towns. Hedeby, Ribe, Kaupang, Reykjavik came later, but the same principle applied. And here's the twist. The Skull Cup myth doesn't fit any of them. Because when we imagine the Vikings as one people, one culture, one attitude, we lose sight of how diverse they were. A chieftain in Iceland lived a different life than a Rus warlord in Novgorod. A Norwegian trader hauling walrus ivory didn't think like a Danish raider looking to make a name in Northumbria. Their rituals, beliefs, even their drinking customs, not always the same. Historians still argue whether it's even useful to speak of Viking culture as a singular thing. Increasingly, the term is being replaced in scholarship by Norse societies or Scandinavian seafarers' phrases that allow for variety, nuance, contradiction. And contradiction matters here, because maybe somewhere someone did drink from a skull once, out of madness, or desperation, or theatrical spite. But did the Vikings do it? Not really. Because the Vikings weren't one thing, and the story that treats them like one thing, one savage, skull-sipping horde, isn't just inaccurate. It's disrespectful. It flattens the complexity, erases the architecture, turns real people into caricatures. You think back to the graves you walked past, the woman buried with weaving tools and a carved drinking bowl, the man laid to rest with a horn beside his shield, the child wrapped in linen, a toy tucked in the crook of a tiny elbow. Were they Viking sometimes? But mostly they were Norse, and they were human. They sang, they mourned, they ate soup, they worried about debt, they watched the weather, they navigated by stars. And when they drank together, it was with ritual, not rage. The feast was about memory. The horn was a vessel for lineage. The toast was a bond, not a threat. You leave the market behind, walking now through a narrow pass of time and thought. The further you go, the less the word Viking feels like a person and more like a lens. One we've looked through too long without questioning the distortion. And now you're starting to see clearly. The skull cup isn't part of the Viking story. It's part of our story, how we shape the past to fit a fear, or a fantasy, or a perfectly edgy plot point. But the truth, it's older, softer, stranger. You smile to yourself, because the real Vikings weren't monsters. They were people who told better stories than the ones we gave them. You emerge from the pass of thought and back into open air. This time you stand on the edge of a funeral again, but this one's different. No fire, no ship, no chanting, just stillness. The wind moves softly through the grass, brushing against stones that have stood longer than memory. You're in a cemetery, but not a Christian one, and not quite pagan either. Somewhere in between, a field of mounds, a space between worlds, and what you find here is not fear, not fury, but reverence. You watch as a family prepares for a ritual, not a raid, not a sacrifice, just a quiet, final goodbye. The deceased, an elder perhaps, has been washed, dressed, and laid on a fur-lined platform, not with treasure, not with war trophies, but with tokens of identity, a comb, a brooch, a staff, a small drinking vessel carved with flowers. You step closer. It's not a skull. It's wood, polished with years of use. A simple thing, not meant to shock, meant to belong. Because in the end, even warriors died like everyone else, needing comfort ceremony and something familiar to carry with them. This is where the myth of the skull cup fully collapses, because death to the Norse wasn't just an event. It was a transition, a delicate one. They believed in many possible afterlives, Valhalla, for the battles slain sure, but also Folkvanger Helheim, the sea, the mound, even the memory of the living. Wherever the dead went, they deserved respect, which is why Viking funerals didn't involve desecration. Historians still argue over the exact meaning of Viking burial rituals, whether some of them were influenced by Eastern traditions, whether burning or burying reflected social rank, whether grave goods were symbolic or literal. But one thing is consistent across hundreds of graves. There is care. You don't give someone a finely carved cup if you think they were an object. You give it because they were part of your story, and now they're part of the earth. You turn your gaze to the mourners now. One person pours mead onto the ground. Another sips and hands the vessel to a third. A silent circle. A liquid farewell. No skulls, no trophies, just connection. This is what archaeologists find again and again, cups made from materials that were gentle, familiar, symbolic. Horns passed down generations. Wooden bowls bearing fingerprints long erased. In one grave, a clay cup resting against a skeleton's palm, perhaps the last drink ever shared. you sit on the grass, and you remember how you started this journey, so sure you'd find something wild, something savage, a trophy of war turned into a drinking cup. But what you've found instead is people, soft and strange and ritualistic and tired, just like us. And still the myth lingers, maybe because we like our past in extremes, good and evil, hero and villain, horn and skull. But the truth is always quieter. A Viking might take a head in battle, yes, might mount it as a warning, but drink from it, not when it mattered, not when the fires were low and the voices solemn, not when grief required gentleness. You look again at the vessel being passed among the mourners. It's old, not valuable, not ornate, but trusted. That's what mattered. The Skull Cup story is loud. It's useful for dramatic reenactments and YouTube thumbnails. But it doesn't belong here. Not among the dead. Not among those who still believe that memory was sacred. So maybe this is the moment when you finally let it go. You watch the family bury their elder. They don't say much, just a few words, a nod, and a final silent toast poured onto the grass. Then they walk away, not because they forget, but because they remember well enough not to need the myth. You rise slowly from the grassy mound, the earth damp beneath your palms, and the air now still as breath held too long. The funeral is over, but your journey isn't, not yet. Not until we find out how this skull cup, this phantom vessel, this missing myth, became so real in the modern mind. It's time to talk about how misunderstanding turns into memory. You step through centuries now, light flickering, like pages turning, books open around you, dusty, gilded, dog-eared, translated 3 times and annotated poorly. And in those books you see it, the myth, evolving. A single poetic metaphor becomes a marginal note. That note becomes a footnote. The footnote becomes a line in a history textbook. Then it becomes a documentary. Then a graphic novel. Then a TikTok video with ominous music and text that reads, "Did Vikings drink from skulls?" And suddenly it's true. Because if you have heard something 5 times from 5 different sources, it starts to sound like a fact, even if each of those sources is just repeating the last. You flip through one book, now 17th century Icelandic poetry. The infamous line dances across the page from the curved branches of skulls we drank. But we know now what that means. It's not literal. It's not even original. It's a kenning, a metaphor for horns. Still someone mistranslates. Someone simplifies. Someone likes the image too much to let it go. And just like that, it spreads. The 18th and 19th centuries are particularly guilty. As Europe industrializes, it also romanticizes the past. The Viking Age becomes a canvas for nationalism, for folklore, for political myth-making. They are reshaped into noble savages, pagan rebels, proto-heroes of whatever country wants to borrow their story. And what makes a hero more exciting? Turning your enemies into tableware. You walk now through the salons of Victorian artists and amateur historians, white-bearded men painting grand oil portraits of horn-helmeted warriors, drinking from heads, while women in flowing gowns swoon dramatically in the background. None of it's accurate. All of it's intentional. They weren't writing history. They were writing drama. And it didn't stop there. The early 20th century picks up the thread, weaving it into pulp novels, fantasy epics, and museum plaques written with more style than substance. One 1910 guide to the Norsemen describes barbaric feasting rituals involving the spoils of the battlefield, perhaps even the heads of fallen foes. That perhaps is doing a lot of work. Historians still argue whether these misstatements were innocent or part of a larger effort to paint Vikings as brutal others, especially in countries trying to draw moral lines between themselves and their raiding ancestors. And then the myth jumps mediums. Enter film, television, games. It starts small. A villain drinking from a skull in a silent film. A prop department in the 1960s saying, "Hey, wouldn't this look cool?" By the time you reach the 1990s, the skull cup is everywhere. On book covers, in RPG manuals, in Conan the Barbarian knockoffs and late-night cable specials with zero research budgets and unlimited fog machines. And you grew up with it, not because it was taught, but because it was assumed, a shortcut for savagery, a symbol of a wild, unknowable past, a way to make Viking culture pop in a 2-second montage. But now, standing here surrounded by the dusty echo of bad citations and good storytelling, you see how easily a myth becomes memory. You imagine someone, maybe a kid, reading that one line in a school book. They repeat it at dinner. Someone else hears it. It becomes a "did you know" factoid, one of those irresistible little things that doesn't need proof because it sounds true enough. And before long, it's everywhere. On beer bottles, on Instagram infographics, on t-shirts that say "Skull" or "Die." But truth, it got left behind in the translation. The real vessels, the wooden bowls, the carved horns, the imported glassware, they're still in museums, still in graves, still speaking quietly to those who care to listen. You reach out now and touch one of those imagined vessels. It's smooth, undecorated, utterly unremarkable. And it's real. The skull cup never was. But the need for it, that's been with us a long time. It makes us feel like we understand the past, like we've glimpsed something primal. But what we've really seen is ourselves projected backward in bone. And it's time we let that projection go. Not because the myth isn't interesting, but because the truth, it's so much more. The wind shifts again, not sharp this time, but slow, almost thoughtful. You feel it carry you away from dusty pages and misquoted books. The myth has unfolded. The cups, the poetry, the graves, they've all spoken their piece. And now you find yourself walking back through time in reverse, retracing the steps of a story that never quite belonged to the people it was told about. Because it's time to follow the skull cup that never was, from beginning to end. You're in a room now, not a longhouse, not a battlefield, a museum, maybe, or a library. There's glass cases, informational plaques, the soft squeak of a curator's shoes on polished floors. You walk past helmets, mislabeled Viking, past swords, with authentic stamped in cursive, and you stop at the object that started it all, a line of poetry, frozen in translation. The display reads, "From the curved wood of skulls." There's a drawing next to it. A man holding what's clearly a human skull, hollowed and polished, filled with some amber liquid. The plaque says, "Artist's Interpretation." You stare at it, and suddenly the entire journey comes into focus. This isn't just about a misunderstanding. It's about how stories evolve, mutate, echo. How a metaphor gets misread, a mistranslation gets popularized. A myth becomes merchandise. And soon it doesn't matter whether anyone ever actually did it, because we all believe they might have. And that belief, it's sticky. So you start tracking the story's footprints backward, step by step. First, there's the reenactments where the skull cup is a prop. Then the docuseries where it's a rhetorical flourish. Then the museum catalogs citing literary references but offering no physical evidence. Then the Victorian artists painting their brutal imaginings. Before them, the translators, some accurate, others enthusiastic. And finally, that lonely poet in 17th century Iceland conjuring an image meant to evoke war and memory, not bone and drink. His pen scratches out the line. He probably thought nothing of it. He never meant to launch 1,000 memes. But once that cup existed in a reader's mind, it was too perfect to discard. Historians still argue whether the persistence of the skull cup myth is a failure of scholarship or just the natural evolution of culture. After all, every society needs its monsters, its rituals, its symbols. And this one, it's potent. The image of a warrior drinking from a skull is easy to remember, easy to believe, and nearly impossible to fact-check when you're half asleep watching the History Channel at 2 a.m. or scrolling a battle-themed Reddit thread. And once pop culture gets its hands on it, forget it. A skull cup isn't just a cup. It's a shortcut to power, to barbarism, to metal album covers and cartoonish masculinity. And every fantasy game where you need to tell the audience who the dangerous one is without a single word. It doesn't matter that archaeologists have never found one, or that no saga mentions it, or that the cultural and spiritual logic of Norse death rites makes it wildly improbable. Because belief, especially the kind shaped by repetition, is sticky. And maybe that's the real lesson, that sometimes we don't inherit truth. We inherit what feels true. And what feels true is often the product of what gets repeated, reprinted, reimagined. like a game of historical telephone played over 1,000 years, across languages, across cultures, across agendas. The skull cup was never real, but its shadow was. You take one last look at the museum plaque. You smile, because the real story is more interesting, more human, more strange. A culture rich in poetry and humor, ritual and rebellion. A people who drank from carved horns and cherished the quiet bond of a shared cup. Who honored the dead with mead, not mockery. Who feared forgetting far more than dying. You leave the museum. The myth stays behind. It always does. You walk out into the night one final time. No horns now. No helmets. No ghostly laughter from half-remembered feasts. Just the hush of the earth, settling under stars that have watched it all, truth fiction, and the strange places in between. And somewhere far from museums and manuscripts, far from Hollywood sets and sagas half lost to time, you begin to see the real shape of the story. You, just you, standing on the edge of everything we thought we knew about Vikings and skull cups and ancient rituals that never were. And for the first time it feels quiet, not the hollow silence of missing facts, but the full, gentle quiet of something finally put to rest. So, let's say it plain now. One last time, Vikings probably didn't drink from skulls. They might have heard of people who did. They might have joked about it. They might have written metaphors that later minds misunderstood. But when it came time to raise a cup, to mourn a father, to toast a god, to mark a vow, they chose horn, or wood, or glass. They chose tradition. They chose memory. And skulls, those stayed buried. Historians still argue whether the persistence of this myth says more about the Vikings or about us. Maybe it's both. We want the past to be vivid, visceral, soaked in danger. We want blood stains and bone cups and thunder in the sky, but what the past often gives us is softer, stranger, quietly human. A carved bowl passed down a family line. A horn shared between brothers before a battle. A mother pouring the first drink of the funeral feast, her hand shaking only a little. The truth doesn't need sharpening. It just needs seeing. So now you stand here, blinking in the starlight. The story behind you, the myth, finally unwound. And what's left? Respect. Not for the skull, but for the cup, the real one, the one they used to carry grief and joy and legacy, not violence. So the next time you see that familiar image, the Viking warrior with a skull held high, blood dripping from its eye sockets, fire reflecting in his teeth, you'll smile. Not because it's true, but because you know better now. And better is good. Better means peace. Better means sleep. Now take a breath, a long one. Let it fill your chest. Let it leave slowly, Let your shoulders drop. You've walked a long way through time tonight, through sagas and graves, through poetry and propaganda, through fear and fascination. You've chased a myth, not to kill it, but to see what it's hiding. And now you've seen. The past is never simple, but it is beautiful. It's full of strange metaphors and half-truths and people who loved and lied and lived just like we do. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the truth doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to breathe. So as you settle in now, blanket pulled up, breath slowing, thoughts loosening. Remember, history doesn't always need to roar. Sometimes it's the whisper at the edge of a candle, the trace of ash in the wind, the curve of a cup, not because it shocked anyone, but because it held something important, just like you do now. So close your eyes. Let the longhouse fade. Let the ships drift from shore. Let the warriors rest. No more toasting, no more guessing. Just the steady hum of sleep, of soft breath, of everything you now know. The skull cup never existed. But your peace, that's very real. Sleep well, traveler. You've earned it.